Hey everyone, Amy Bowser-Tennant here, the Genealogy Reporter, and it is Family Story Friday. I have something important to share with you today, something I learned while conducting interviews recently for 9/11. I wanted to conduct some interviews of my family, my immediate family, my husband, my sisters, my mom and dad, about what they experienced and felt and remembered about 9/11. And in doing so, I realized that there were some things about interviewing that maybe I hadn't considered before, and I wanted to share that with you. There's a sweet spot for just the right time to interview someone about a significant event. A significant event like, for example, 9/11. A traumatic event, the loss of a child, a horrible accident, perhaps some sort of natural disaster that someone has lived through. These are things that we may want to interview our family members about. Obviously, we can't interview a person right after the event happened, right? You know, the day of. Tell me everything. Where were you? What were you doing? What did you think? What did you feel? What did it smell like? We can't do that, right? A lot of times the emotions and the things that a person is going through in the days following such a traumatic event are still raw. It's not really appropriate, even possibly into the weeks and months following a particular event. It just may not be appropriate or even beneficial to seriously interview someone about something that had just taken place that was monumental. However, you might say, if this person were really close to you, say a sister, you might say, oh my goodness, I can't believe you lived through that horrible wildfire. How did you guys escape? How did you get out? And maybe your sister says, it was just by the skin of our teeth. We got in the car, we drove for X many miles, so-and-so was there at the corner and we ran to them and they brought us out, and I'm just so thankful to be alive. And so maybe you might jot those few details, but you're not going to interrogate a person in the days or weeks or maybe even months after something like that has happened. But you also don't want to wait too long to ask questions about what happened, because then they may forget the details. So that's what I mean by this sweet spot of just the right timing to ask specific questions about a monumental event in someone's life. I also feel that when you're asking too soon, you may miss out on some very poignant parts to their story, to their experience. Because just like that old adage, hindsight's 20/20, I know in my own life that as trials have come and as I've gone through different experiences, time brings clarity sometimes, and more focus, more understanding about what happened, how it happened, and how that affected me. So I thought about that and thought, that almost means that maybe when a traumatic type event happens in our family lives, that there should be multiple times where we interview a person or persons about the event. Meaning, there's that initial, are you okay? How in the world did you, make it? Is there anything I can do? And you write down what happened that day, maybe even that very day. And then in the weeks following, you continue to work with this person. Maybe they'll share little details with you here and there, and you might want to jot those down. And then some years later, when there's a little more peace, a little more reflection, you could interview them more substantially. Can you tell me more about where you were, what you were doing, what you were thinking, how you were feeling? And then even further down the road, some 10 years later, or even 15 years later. So because your perspective changes, right? I mean, I think we could all agree on that. And so the story doesn't change, it develops. I think that's key to family interviews. So I interviewed my family members, my sisters and my parents and my husband, and of course I wrote down my own story about what we were thinking and feeling during 9/11. That was very interesting to me. Our perspectives were very different depending on our ages, depending on our occupations, and where we lived in particular. I thought that was interesting. I guess I would have expected that. I just wasn't prepared for it. I just didn't think about it ahead of time. So for example, in September of 2001, my husband was active duty military, and we were assigned to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We were living on post at the time. Just so happens, my husband was attending an anti-terrorism class that week. He came home on Monday evening and said what a boring class it was. They just didn't really pay it much attention. You can bet your bottom dollar that come Wednesday when they returned to class, they put a lot more priority into that class. It meant a whole lot more. But he remembers that he was attending this class. They had gone on a morning break, that he returned back to check on his lieutenants, and they were all gathered around the TV and acting kind of strange. And he asked him what had happened, and at that time they said that there had been a plane crash into one of the towers, and no one was talking about terrorism quite yet until the next time Chad came in, and then they realized by this time that this was a terrorist attack. He remembers thinking, okay, this is the real deal. I'm going to pay attention more in my class. And we knew that that was going to have a significant repercussion on many of our friends, if not our own family, because we were active duty. I remember for myself, I was on my way to a hospital appointment there on post. I was so glad I stayed on post because all the people who had left post that morning couldn't get back on until late into the evening. I had my 3-month-old and 2-year-old with me. And we went to the post hospital, and at the front door, as well as every entrance, there were armed men with M16s. That didn't necessarily alarm me. Hey, we live on an Army base. I heard M16 fire every day of my life at Fort Leonard Wood. So I didn't think much about it. But then when they started wanting to check through all my bags and the stroller and all sorts of things, I thought something's definitely gone on. Something's happened. I didn't know what it was. Once I'd entered the hospital, it was clear that something tragic had happened. Many people were crying, briskly walking through the halls, trying to get to their places. I went on up to the second floor, come into the lobby of the waiting room of where we waited to get our allergy shots, which is why I was there. And I looked at the TV and I saw the New York skyline with one lone tower. And I'm not familiar with New York. I've never been to New York City. And I looked at the nurse and said, I thought there were 2 towers. And that nurse, I will never forget the look on their face as he turned to me and he said, it's gone. That's all I said. It hit me then. I guess maybe I could I was hearing the commentating on TV, so I recognized what then had happened. I started seeing the reruns of the planes crashing into the towers, and then of course the first one falling. But by the time I had reached the TV for live, there was only one tower standing. And so after that, I went to get gas. I'm still on post. Lots of people crying, talking about the fact that now the men will be called up, which of course I immediately worried about my own husband and what that would mean. And then I went home. Airspace was shut down. That was a really weird thing because, like I said, we had ordnance and M16 fire all the time. Well, you didn't hear that for days. And there were helicopters and planes coming over our house nonstop, day after day, and it was so quiet. It was just eerily quiet. I remember thinking about that and just how weird it was. So it was very high stress on post for a lot of weeks. So we had that perspective where we had a really intense feeling of fear, worry for the future and so forth, as well as being afraid of possibly, would we be attacked because we're an Army base? Are we being targeted? I was so worried. I thought, we wouldn't even know if we were under attack because we can hear bombs going off in the back 40 all the time, and we never worry about it. You don't think about it. You hear, planes going by really low and helicopters flying by really low, and nobody ever gives it a second thought. And I thought, we could be under attack and we wouldn't even know it until it was too late. So I was very fearful. Now, When I interviewed my mom and dad and youngest sister, who was in the sixth grade at the time of the 9/11 attack, this is where I learned to not wait too long to ask your interview questions. I also learned that perspective matters. We have this sixth grader, my baby sister at the time, and my mother and my father as adults. Remembering this situation two very different ways. I interviewed them all separately. I think that's the key. That has always been my standard operating procedure. With interviews, I interview everybody separate. I don't want to have one person's memories affect the other person's story. But then when I get serious conflicting information about a story, I go back a second time and have them interview together to try to work it out. That's what I've done in the past. That's what I did this time. It was interesting. So I first interviewed my mom. Mom, where were you? She says, I remember exactly. I was in the kitchen. I was cooking breakfast. Your dad was home from work. I don't know why. He was in the bathroom getting ready. He came out to tell me what had happened. We watched it on TV. I was very worried. She wanted to go get my sister Andrea from school, and Dad said, not yet, let's wait. Now, they live not far from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and Mom was very worried that Wright-Patterson would be targeted, and so she was worried for her family safety, as well as the fact that Chad and I were at an Army base, and Chad was active duty military, and she was very worried about that as well. So those were her memories. Then I called my sister Andrea and asked her, and she says, oh yes, I remember exactly. I was in the sixth grade. The principal came over the intercom. He was crying. He told us what happened. We didn't understand it really, what was going on, until they turned the TVs on. And then we realized something's definitely wrong. She said when the parents started showing up, then we knew, we were real scared. And I said, do you remember if Dad came and got you? And she says, yes, we were told to get our backpacks, that we were going home early, school would be closed, and I remember Dad picking me up. I remember him not saying anything, but rather just giving me a big hug, and I was so glad he was there. Then I interviewed my dad, and he says, I know exactly where I was. I was at work. I was working over at the Career Center. I said, okay, because remember, Mom said he was at home. And he said, and someone came and told me what was going on. We pulled the TVs out into the hallway. We all gathered around. We were talking about that. And that's about all I can remember. Just thinking, oh, this is really sad and horrible event. I said, so you don't remember talking to Mom about maybe going to getting Andrea from school? And he goes, no, we didn't get Andrea from school. I said, well, Andrea says she remembers you picked her up from school. He goes, no, I don't think so, no. And so then when I pulled Mom and Dad back together, Mom was certain that Dad was at the house when it happened, and Dad was certain he was at work, and they both agreed that they did not pick up Andrea, but Andrea is certain she was picked up by Dad. So there you have it. We waited too long to ask the questions, perhaps, in that case. But it's a great example to show how different people are going to think differently. They're going to feel differently. They're going to remember differently. And as the experience percolates year after year, the story develops, not grows or changes per se, but develops an understanding, a better reflection of how you felt and what you felt if you don't wait too long to get that story down. So that is a little bit about the interviews I conducted and what I learned. I think it's very valuable and important. Remember, there's a sweet spot for just when to ask those interview questions about a poignant event in your family's life. And maybe that interview happens more than once, relatively soon after the event, in a small way, maybe a year later-ish, maybe several years later, to really get a reflection of how that event may have changed the person's life and perspective. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of Family Story Friday, and I hope you get out there and record some family stories of your own. Thanks for joining me here again on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join us every Tuesday for Genealogy Tip Tuesday, Thursdays for Genealogy Thoughts Thursday, and Fridays for Family Story Friday. Thanks, and have a great day. Bye-bye.